Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. This is a stream I definitely didn't plan on making, but we did have a lot of news coming out today, or to be more precise, one big piece of news, and then some piecemeal stuff that basically concludes some older story, or at least fits in some extra details from the past. So I really didn't want to miss that opportunity. My microphone seems to work. I'm always paranoid about that because of that soft touch controls. Yeah, so today we are gonna react to Geekerwan's analysis of the Dimensity 9400 from Mediatek. It's inside the Oppo Find X8 Pro with some pretty fast memory and interesting things like that. So I would love to comment on all of that. Now that we are finally seeing iOS 18 fixing some A18 performance stuff, it stands to reason that I can finally start creating my big, beautiful graph. Maybe not necessarily with Geekerwan data, but because of their tendency to go absolutely apeshit on cooling and stuff like that. But once Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 is out, I think this is when we can start it. And until the end of the year, we should have a beautiful, beautiful chart of A18, A18 Pro, Dimensity 9400, Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, Apple M4, and Lunar Lake at the very least. Maybe some older gens, maybe something else, but that's about what I'm trying to target, and it's definitely good to have more data. You guys know I do have some long-standing issues with how Dimensity testing, how Geekerwan conducts its testing. However, you know, it's kind of like in a test, right? When you make one mistake in a big and beefy math task, if you make one mistake in between but then the rest is correct, it's like a follow-up mistake basically. So what I'm basically saying, if Mediatek is getting one chip wrong, they're getting all chips probably equally wrong. So we'll have to see how that goes. And Relay already joining the chat. Hello, man. I know I probably won't have very high live viewership. It's just not my usual time to stream. We've had quite some lovely live streams recently. If that's not going to happen today, that's okay. I will be back to my regularly scheduled timing, probably around Friday. Tomorrow we are getting a little bit of hurricane, or at least some very strong winds here in Europe, like for the very first time in like 150 years. So I'll have to see how my internet and everything works tomorrow, and I'll let you know if there's anything to even stream about. Like with today, I honestly didn't plan to, so there's always some stuff that might come up. Now, before we actually get into the Dimensity 9400 stuff, there is some very quick Apple-related news. Now, this is coming from Min-Chi Kuo saying iPhone 16 sales are roughly matching expectations. There are no cutbacks anticipated. That, of course, stands in contrast to I believe, the Barclay report from last week, saying that iPhone 16 will get cutbacks in orders for parts. Seemingly, that's not happening, so that's really good. But yeah, it just goes to show, like, we've had like all that stuff initially that like, oh, weekend one sales are subdued and stuff like that, and then it just turns out, it's completely meaningless. Some region might have higher demand, some region might have lower demand. It might have taken a little bit of time for Apple's marketing to work. Apple Intelligence now seems to actually be like something that people really talk about and expect to come. It's not like some kind of ethereal idea. So I have said time and time again, I expect the iPhone 16 generation to roughly end up in the ballpark of the iPhone 14 and 15 series, maybe a little higher than iPhone 14, but maybe a little lower than iPhone 15. There being nothing surprising about that. And maybe if Apple Intelligence really has some kind of super viral feature, I could actually see it maybe even overtaking iPhone 15 Gen, but that would roughly depend, of course, on Apple's willingness willingness to lower prices in markets like Japan, India, where recently Japan has had like a currency issue. China is trying to motivate its people to buy domestic brands. So maybe Apple will need to pull a few more levers in those regions. Yeah, basically he is saying that the base iPhone 16 and 16 Plus have been lackluster. At this point though, I'm struggling to understand what exactly is like that lackluster in comparison, because it feels like it's being said every single year. It reminds me a little bit of Square Enix and the gaming market, where they're like, oh, this game came below our expectations. And they literally say that about every big game they make. So I'm like, guys, have you considered that it's maybe your expectations that are wrong and not us as consumers in how many we actually buy of your games? Yeah, and this seemingly like either Apple's understanding of demand for the base iPhones is misguided, or Min-Chi Kuo's expectations for those models were misguided. I would believe that is probably the more correct interpretation here, given that he has actually said that like early sales of heavily favored the 16 and 16 Plus versus the Pro models, at least in comparison to last year. So again, I'm trying to tell you guys, Apple knows what it's doing. They have a very sophisticated logistics chain. They have a marketing team that knows what it's doing across the world. They have levers to pull because their profit margin is pretty high, so they can create deals across the world that match like certain issues, currency demand, government intervention, stuff like that. And don't forget that early next year we are getting the iPhone SE 4. So whatever is Apple might be lackluster right now in overall demand, but maybe high in average sales price. It might all completely shift next year with iPhone SE 4 pushing ASP down, but also bringing sales up pretty heavily. God knows if they really partner with India and bring down production pricing and lower regulatory hurdles for them in India, that might create a big boom for that. So yeah, I wouldn't be worried about Apple. That's all I'm trying to say. Really, we are going to talk about the Dimensity. Don't worry. This is just some very quick like housework stuff, basically. Next is actually a little bit more like, and Apple Intelligence surveys show that people actually do plan to potentially upgrade quicker to the iPhone 16 lineup. Maybe not right now, but when Apple Intelligence is actually out. So whatever Apple is doing with the marketing, it seems to work, but people are actually waiting for Apple Intelligence. So actually kudos to people to doing as they're supposed to, which is voting with your wallet and actually waiting for a feature to launch before you buy a product based on that feature. Unless, of course, you just like the iPhone 16 in general, and then Apple Intelligence is like a cherry on top. But in that regard, the iPhone 16 still wouldn't stand out in comparison to iPhone 15, 14 series, stuff like that. In the past, it should just sell pretty normally until it starts selling maybe better thanks to Apple Intelligence, maybe at some point a little worse because iPhone SE maybe cannibalizes some base iPhone sales. So this gen might be very interesting. Unfortunately, of course, Apple does not give us those kinds of deep breakdowns on like per model sales and stuff like that. But maybe the likes of Min-Chi Kuo, supply chain analysts and stuff like that will be able to give us some interesting data. Now we are getting to benchmark stuff, but we are not starting right away with benchmark stuff about the Dimensity 9400. We have talked about, of course, the stolen M4 MacBook Pros. My last video is doing quite well in basic engagement. Please feel free to go back there, leave a like, leave a comment, all that jazz. And we are now getting more and more stuff. Now, I do not want too much to comment really on data based on stolen devices. This is coming from Vadim Yurev, so I'm not even sure. Maybe he has some people in Russia who could help him with getting that data, because I haven't seen those Cinebench results anywhere else. And basically, there is a huge uplift in Cinebench 2024 results from 640 to 977. So that's a 50% uplift. and that's absolutely insane. That's multi-core results, and in single core we are getting 174. Of course, when you actually look at the base M3, it had already pretty much the highest Cinebench 2024 single core results. These results, this is the 1DE version, the absolute highest end version. I haven't actually found laptops with it, so this is a completely overclocked X Elite. Yeah, but the X Elite comes close, but this is ironically the only test where it gets that close. But yeah, single core results on the X Elite are definitely decent, definitely good even, but it does consume quite a lot of power to get there. And now, of course, Apple is pulling even further ahead at 170 and stuff like that. It will be higher in this regard than the just released Lunar Lake mobile parts, than the AMD A9X whatever. At this point've forgotten, so that's interesting. And before we get into some really deep breakdowns on the Dimensity 9400, this is a shout out to Raphael, who does aggregate some really good data on Twitter, which is whenever people really want to compare games, iPhones usually run at higher resolutions, that's for one, but also the settings differences can be huge. And I know people here are looking at the water, right? But LOD in general is huge. Like that entire basin basically in front of the other island, for one, that's all data missing here. Of course, all the LOD of the actual mountain range or the hills, that's completely different. But also, even more importantly, look at the shadow difference, because shadows are real. Now, of course, LOD is a big thing, but LOD can sometimes be just maybe we tweaked settings wrong. But the fact that they allow objects so far away to render shadows on the A18 Pro and that is stuff that also can be very impactful on RAM amount. And obviously the iPhone here gives you half the memory or a third less memory depending on which configuration we're looking at. So this is the Dimensity 9300, and I highly encourage you guys to really consider that the results we are seeing for the Dimensity 9400 will have some of those issues. So when I will refrain a little bit from making a final conclusion when it comes to which one is better, A18 or Dimensity, it will at least in the GPU department, it will at least be partially to blame on the fact that it's really hard one-to-one to compare settings. Even the absolute best YouTubers in that regard, like Mr. Mac Wright, unfortunately aren't capable of putting settings one-to-one. You don't even get full-on resolution sliders. You don't get settings adjustments where you get really into very detailed comparisons here. You just put everything on high and you see just those huge staggering differences. So whenever people are oh, the iPhone does this or that, and often the fun fact is that the iPhone actually, thanks to stuff I know dynamic caching is not technically for that, but thanks to just better API optimization and things like that, the iPhone actually often uses less memory even while running at such significantly higher quality settings. And don't forget, of course, there's still the complete baffling lack of proper Apple MetalFX upscaling integration. So I know that Genshin Impact actually has it. For some reason, people don't really test with it. But yeah, I just wanted to give you guys that kind of understanding before we get into it. So thanks Twitter, I guess, for aggregating some pretty useful data before we start. Sam Hine joining the chat saying it's a different game. Yeah, this is literally a generational difference. This would be coming from a PS3 to a PS4 relatively. Tippermaster, what's up? Have we seen any good full in-depth thermal system tests between the 16 and 16 Pro yet? We've seen some We haven't seen very good tests yet, or at least we haven't seen a lot of tests yet. But I recommend you visit Dametek's YouTube channel, and he just tested the iPhone 16 Plus, and he said that, well, basically, if you're fine playing at 60 hertz and 60 FPS, you're absolutely golden with using that. Andrew is saying, I'll take the Dimensity, anything that keeps Genshin away. Yeah, well, that's a you thing, but it does apply to other games too. It's one thing that absolutely fascinates me is that there isn't like an official Genshin port to macOS, because if it runs that well on a passively cooled A series chip, it baffles me that they wouldn't utilize at least like their like 25 million Apple Silicon Mac users who might be like mildly interested in a game that is completely free, gives you a lot of actual like you can play a decent amount before having to pay for anything. Technically, you can never pay for anything if you want to. And I just feel like that's a missed market opportunity. Sam Hines saying, whichever game you test, the A18 is going to provide higher quality. No excuses. Well, the excuses is, and I will actually be a little bit nice here, the excuse is not that the Dimensity is actually deserving of higher scores. The excuse is that it's an API issue, and we don't know what the performance impact of those higher settings would be. Like, what I don't like, for example, is when Geekerwan says, oh, look, it is more efficient than the iPhone, but the iPhone runs at 20% higher resolution. And I'm like, no, it consumes a little bit less power at around the same FPS while running at low resolution. At best, they are kind of equal. Really, it's close to 120 FPS on M4. What do you mean? Like, have you tested Genshin Impact on M4? Oh, on the iPad, of course. Yeah, thank you. Tipomaster, lol, I never liked Genshin gameplay. Yeah, but we are looking here at mobile standards. Don't forget, people even play this stuff on console, so I guess it cannot be that bad. But yeah, I'm somebody like, I play God of War, Ghost of Tsushima. Those are my kind of games. Like, yeah, I'm not gonna like invest too much time into Genshin Impact. You did enjoy Star Rail, which is fine. Yeah, I've heard some good things about it too, but it does dim the display on everything 15 Pro and before within 10 minutes. Yeah, I usually, like, I'm pretty aggressive in just turning down settings and maybe even starting from the ground up with a slightly lower brightness level, and then just the heat soak happens a lot later on. And Angelica giving us a great start for me to actually call out the YouTube chat saying hello to all of us, and it's great that we can all meet. And with that, actually, a shout out to all the YouTube support you can do here, guys. Subscribing to the channel, liking the video, commenting. You guys see, I love interacting with you live, getting all your impact or all your ideas, all your agreements, all your disagreements. Share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. And as always, if you want to support me directly, consider leaving a small super chat or super sticker. Of course, you can become a channel member, and shout out go to Angelica and Max Maximus here, who are both Mediatek Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube, or you can go over on Patreon and become a supporter over there. Being there also, of course, gives you an opportunity to chat with me directly and suggest ideas for further videos and stuff like that. And as always, I highly recommend you guys, once the video is actually finished, please go to the regular comment section and leave a comment over there. It helps tremendously with the algorithm. I know you guys are very tuned into the live chat, but please, just 5 seconds after the video, leave a regular comment. That helps out a lot. So now that we have actually basically all the preamble out of the way, let's look into Geekerwan. And of course, we need subtitles for Geekerwan. It should be noted, of course, as always, the translation quality does have its issues with Geekerwan. I wish they went back to making more regular English-speaking videos. Like, the guy seems to speak English so well. Like, I really wonder, like, would it really be such a big issue to create that? Maybe they just want everyone to go to one channel and like boost the algorithm that way. Of course, this channel having now over 2 times as many subscribers as their English-speaking one. Maybe just so many of their viewership just comes from China. But yeah, I'm a little disappointed in that. I would love, of course, to have all their stuff easily available in a language I easily speak. So if German or Russian fits them, that's okay with me as well. Maybe a little bit of Latin.
下半年是一个重磅新品接着一个重磅新品。
True. By the end of October, we should be seeing a lot of Dimensity 9400 based products. We should be seeing the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 launching in a much more comprehensive way. Of course, we've had a lot of teasers from all these companies by now, so that will be interesting. Yeah. So definitely October is a busy month, and by the end of it, we are, of course, kind of looking forward to finishing the month with Apple's M4 event, M4 MacBook Pro, Mac Mini, iMac, M4 Pro, M4 Max chips, even like the new iPad Mini, which I have betted, well, no, not money. Well, I have bet. The betted is not correct grammar, I believe. I apologize. And I have speculated, let's put it better that way, that the iPad Mini will come with an A18 chip, like the 5-core version. And I actually do have, based on this video, I do have some criticism towards Apple, believe it or not. Not actually to the raw performance of the chip, though I do think that everything else considered, there are ways that Apple could have leveraged more performance from the chip. However, I will be very nuanced about that because I know that people who know more than I do and are even bigger Apple fans than I do will be pretty quick to call out those kinds of criticism. So let's actually start.
我们前脚刚聊完 iPhone， 发哥的大招
Yes, true. They have also done a Lunar Lake review, but again, for Windows stuff like testing, I really prefer my kind of channels, even like Hardware Canucks. It's unfortunate that neither Hardware Unboxed nor Gamers Nexus have yet done a comprehensive Lunar Lake review, unfortunately. But I wasn't gonna jump to Geekerwan for that kind of testing.
来了，天玑9400，去年的天玑9300啊，着实给了我们一个大惊喜啊！当时
Okay, this is actually a good opportunity to just go to the Dimensity 9400 website and see what 9400. It's like a James Bond Dimensity 9400. I think that's actually enough. So this is the exact specifications that Mediatek themselves provided. So this is now the official, those are now the official claims by the company. So the main new core is the ARM Cortex-X925, which is clocked at the actually exact frequency we saw. For a while, there was some speculation it might be clocked all the way up to 3.8 gigahertz. It does seem to max out at 3.62. Don't forget, this is not a specific implementation in the smartphone. This is Bill, that's funny. Dimensity 94007. I get that joke. It's like the Captain America thing. I understood that reference. So that's the Cortex X925. That's of course kind of an off-the-shelf design from ARM themselves. And interestingly, they do promise a higher single-core boost of 35% than a multi-core boost of 28%. Of course, don't forget they are jumping here from N4P to the N3E node. So the jump between the Dimensity 9300 and 9300 Plus to the 9400 in terms of nodes is higher than Apple's. Apple, of course, having jumped from the A17 Pro that was based on TSMC's N3B node to the new N3E node. They do talk about stuff like touch response, faster uploading stuff, so that's interesting. Some of that stuff could be related to much faster memory that they utilize, but also larger caches, doubling DL2 cache and increasing DL3 cache by 50%. Similar to Apple's A18 series, they do jump to ARM 9.2. they do not seem to have quite the same comprehensive implementation for stuff like scalable matrix extensions, but it seemingly is there. So, and they are calling it an advantage. Maybe they mean it directly versus the upcoming Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, which is, or Snapdragon 8 Elite, or Snapdragon 8 Ultra. The branding of that chip might be all over the place. Who knows what the final branding actually turns out to be. But ARM v9.2 seems the latest version of hardware we can get. That's of course in reference to the Cortex X925 cores, which one thing that Apple really likes doing that a lot of people downplay is that they actually give the same version of the latest ARM instruction set to every core, the performance and the efficiency cores. So the other performance cores here would be the X4 core, so that would be the performance core from last gen, clocked at 3.3 gigahertz, and I believe it's A725 cores. A720 cores. So those are not ARM v9.2. So if you really want like super duper comprehensive ARM v9 computation based, that's happening here. System level cache, of course, here being a lot lower than Apple's, but they are playing around with just having a lot more P cores. Apple, of course, having 2 P cores. They kind of have 4, but only 1 is super new. Master, does it have 512-bit SME? From everything that I'm seeing right now, it suggests not. But I would have to really look into everything. Maybe Geekerwan actually mentions that. I haven't yet seen an official confirmation here. But let's finish up some of the hardware details here. So larger caches, fastest smartphone memory. That's a big shout out. One thing that I have been pretty disappointed with in terms of Apple in recent years, and I know why it's happening. It's similar to why Apple doesn't give LTPO panels to the entire lineup. That's because supplying the fastest, highest end parts is actually a complicated issue. But Apple is now pretty far behind in terms of memory. They were far behind with 6400 versus 8533. Now they're behind with 7500 LPDDR5X versus 10700 basically. That's around a 42% higher memory bandwidth based on just the memory. Don't forget, when we are talking about chip bandwidth, you also have to involve the cache. Apple still will give you more cache and therefore more internal bandwidth. And some testing over the years have shown that some of the lower ARM chips, like, and by lower I just mean mobile, like not even laptop or something like that, they aren't that good at utilizing the full bandwidth all the time, at least not for every component. Like sometimes the GPU will be able to utilize all the bandwidth, but the CPU might just do a fraction. Now, usually the CPU doesn't need as much bandwidth as the GPU, but at the very least, you kind of could have said, oh, it could use a little more than it actually does. So while this is a complaint I have towards Apple, I wish they at least would have jumped to the 8533, because I assume a lot of 8533 supply would now be open, given the fact that some Android flagships would be switching to 10700. But alas, Apple is still pretty far behind when it comes to peak memory bandwidth. And again, that's excluding the fact that Apple does have more cache still, even after they doubled here down on L2 and L3 cache. Unmatched power efficiency, thanks to TSMC's 3nm node. They are talking about 40% higher power efficiency. That does not seem to apply to the CPU, at least not according to the test by Geekerwan. This does, like, I mean, they do talk about it in regards to the CPU, but that's really not results we are seeing. The GPU does seem noticeably different. The Immortalis G925 GPU with 41% faster peak performance, 40% faster ray tracing performance. So that's actually interesting that they are promising a lower uplift versus raster, which traditional graphics means raster. then like, and by just a 1% difference, at which point I would just say it's 40% faster for both. Who cares that this might be 41%? And they're saying it's 44% more power efficient. We will actually see some huge efficiency gains versus the previous generation. I'm not quite sure, like, what are they exactly comparing it against, whether it's the 9300 or 9300 plus, because the 9300 plus tended to be pretty inefficient, basically being an overclocked part. Yeah, but that's kind of the specs. They do call it leading NPU performance. That's not proven out really by anything. Like the test that I've seen thus far by Geekbench AI really don't line up with that, but maybe they mean once you combine with the GPU, with all the high bandwidth. So there's a lot of marketing points here. They talk about the efficiency of just the image signal processor, which is cool, high res lossless Bluetooth audio playback, which, yeah, this is all of course the problem with what codecs are actually supported by, like wireless earbuds and stuff like that. There's a new vision engine, like basically this new display controllers, a new Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip, new 5G modem. So again, this is a very comprehensive product. Definitely kudos to them. Now, they are utilizing a lot of basically off-the-shelf ARM parts. Every design here is basically an ARM design. The Immortalis GPU, the Cortex A720, the Cortex X4, the Cortex X95. But of course, integrating it all into one comprehensive package is still, like, it's a feat of engineering still. It's definitely not as impressive as a from the ground up product as what Apple does, but they also have much lower budgets to work with. Yeah, so beyond that, there isn't that much else to, I guess, to call out here. It just makes sense as a successor, I guess, to the previous generation devices. What is interesting to me is the ARM Cortex A720. That one, I believe, is clocked at 2.4 gigahertz. So when people told me that the A725 will be clocked at 3.6 gigahertz in the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, don't get me wrong, it would be capable of those kinds of clock speeds, but I'm just trying to tell people it will not be an efficiency core if it runs at those kinds of frequencies. That frequency would basically just exist to trick you into believing that the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 has very high multi-core results. Usually you would clock it somewhere like this, where they don't give actually a frequency here. This one is 3.3 gigahertz, this one is 2.4, I believe. Yeah, so just some warnings for my Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 analysis, where I might not be too kind to the 8 Gen 4's multi-core results, because I will be questioning a lot what the actual end frequencies are for their E-cores. So let's continue.
难以置信的这种全大核设计带来了远超预期的性能和能效。那么今年的天玑9400在设计思路上有没有什么改变呢？还能不能带来像9300那么大幅度的这种进步呢？由于这一次的工程机的解禁时间和零售机的上市时间挨得非常近啊，所以我们实测就直接在零售机上测了。这一期工程机的视频，我们就先深入的分析一下这个天玑。
Yeah, so they did test it directly on the Oppo Find X8 Pro, which is great. This is not a reference product, which I really have a problem with Qualcomm giving you reference results. Like infamously, like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 was kind of like close to 2500 in single core results. No real product in the wild gave you those results. So I'm just trying to be here reasonably critical, while also being true with the fact that there is room here to be more honest for those companies. Of course, a reference device also kind of exists to say, look, it might not be that every smartphone gives you that performance, but maybe a tablet will. So technically, I guess you could make that argument. What is disappointing to me in the grand scheme of the industry is that, for example, Samsung latest tablets launched with the Dimensity 9300. Of course, knowing the performance of the M4 based iPad Pro, how efficient that is, the tandem OLED technology, that will give it far, far higher real-world brightness, better HDR experience than whatever the Samsung tablets are doing. The fact that it cannot even be bothered to give you the latest 3nm based chip, despite devices some costing over $1,000 and the Ultra costing significantly more than that. That is, in my opinion, very disappointing. So again, this is obviously nothing against the actual chips. The Dimensity 9300 for when it came out was pretty good. The 9400 is, in my opinion, really good. I really hope Apple jumps to 2nm next year, not to N3P, but that's an entirely different discussion. So yeah, let's see how it all fares out here.
4好好的解读一下它的架构设计，它的改进在哪里。马上会发的第2期视频啊，我们就会用零售机好好聊一下它的性能和能效，包括我们会专门来看一下。
Is that the wrong Dimensity 9400 video? Oh man, Geekerwan, because they do have an explainer video and no, wait. For 3 hours ago, they do have two. They posted 2 videos at the exact same time. Oh, so this is the explainer and this is the actual reference product. Okay, so we don't need their like well, I guess no. Let us actually watch the in-depth explainer of the architecture before we jump to the 9400. Maybe we can answer some questions, for example, like Tippomaster asking about how wide its SME support is. And those are both like under 15-minute videos. We can live with that. Yeah, but I was confused by both of them having come out simultaneously. That's not really good YouTube practice.
去年呢，9300的 CPU 啊是4颗 X4 超大核搭配4颗 A7。
Yeah, so you can see here, this is actually like they call these chips like the all big core designs. I don't get it. Like they're clearly small cores here, but yeah, I guess that's like a reference to some chips having like just one P core and then having like an intermediary core and stuff like that. But yeah, basically if we jump from 4 X4 cores to 1 X95 core. By the way, guys, you can guess how expensive the N3E Note is and just how much bigger this core is if they are willing to implement just one of them. And yeah, they do jump up here like frequency by 20% on the A720, but it's still the same design. So that will be just based on the new Note, which N3E is not 20% more efficient than N4P by no means. So without architectural improvements to boot. So the E-cores, well, they of course with dynamic clock speeds they can still adjust a lot, but yeah, don't expect like marvelous efficiency gains from the E-cores here.
大核，那今年的9400你乍一看好像变化不大，对吧？还是8个核，那其中7个核用的还是去年的 IP。但是最大的那个超大核它不太一样了，发哥这一次啊换上了 ARM 最新的超大核 X925 架构。这个 X925 我得给你好好讲讲，因为它的变化相当的大。就和上代 X4 的思路一样啊，这一次的 X925 是继续朝着苹果式的巨型核心的方向一路狂奔啊。X925 前端 decoder 的
Like, I mean, they always call Apple's cores like giant, which I guess is a little bit of an excuse to say like, oh, you know, it's good because it's big. But then Apple is actually the ones who utilizes more of their P cores. Like the Dimensity 9300 was so interesting because it had 4 of the latest cores inside. Like, yeah.
宽度呢依然是保持了和上代相同的10宽，
这已经是目前
最宽的 decoder 了。取址阶段 buffer 的尺寸是直接
Wait, isn't Apple's at 10 wide now too? Or are they still at 9?
加了1倍，从32B 来到了64B， 这样可以让更多的指令带面。分支预测模块也有了进一步优化，带来了2倍的指令窗口，再加上 LE 指令带宽的优化和翻倍的 ITLB size， 整体前端设计啊可以说是在上一代规模的这种基础上呢，进一步优化了指令的吞吐量。 而后端最大的变化则是来自 ROB 队列的深度，从上一代的384直接翻倍来到了768，这大幅提升了 X925 核心的乱序执行能力。
Okay, big boost to out of order execution capabilities. I think some of that will make a big impact on the difference between its integer and its floating point capabilities, where floating point seems to have improved drastically more than integer. But yes, a lot of width improvements basically, even though the decode is technically still the same width, but like we have optimizations for L1 and basically everything that leads up to before an execution is happening.
这个可以说是 X925 核心最显著的一个进步了。此外 ，X925 的仿存部分也有改进 ，Load 的 AGU 单元增加了一组，目前是来到了4 Load 加2 Store 的设计。与此同时，它的后端执行单元方面呢也有调整。整数 ALU 以前只能够执行单周期的指令，而现在是可以执行更复杂的双周期操作了。整数的乘法单元数量呢，也从上一代的2个增加到了4个。不过和整数比起来，浮点更是 X925 的重中之重啊。这一代在浮点方面的改进
This is really good stuff from them. We have sometimes questioned like, oh, how wide is the actual decode? Are they getting that data right? Seems like historically they have gotten that right. So this is actually the thing from Geekerwan that I'm most comfortable in watching and analyzing with you guys, because it is interesting and, in my opinion, well done.
非常的大 ，SMD 单元是直接从上代的4路128位扩增到了6路128位，它还增加了一个额外的浮点比较单元，这应该可以大幅提升它的浮点性能。不过除了这一颗超大核 X925 之外啊，这一次剩下的大核们用来验
Yeah, this is going to be interesting because I've already said that in regards to ARM v9.2 and how, well, technically only one core here is even that latest architecture. Like Apple does like to push all its cores to the latest level. Here we see that like 70% of the chip is still the same core type, like higher clocked X4s, higher clocked A720. So this would really depend on a very well made scheduler. I don't know if Android can provide that. I don't know how deep their optimizations into DOS go to give you that stuff that basically that hopefully a task can just fit into that one core. In my opinion, they probably would have been better off just using 2 X925 cores and going from 8 cores to 6. I know that people will say, oh, you're only suggesting that because Apple is a 6-core design, but I think that would have been way cleaner. Of course, they don't use the latest efficiency cores. That's not super inviting, but that will only have impacts, of course, not really on like the high-performance tasks. It will come to bear in multi-core benchmarks and really benchmarks, because I doubt that any real-world tasks would want to use those E-cores next to the P-cores. But of course, it will matter for even just background tasks. I think that's where E-cores are usually the best at.
是去年的 X4 和 A720， 并没有上 ARM 新出的 A725 啊，这个略有遗憾了。但这个遗憾和接下来的惊喜比起来，倒也不算什么啊。你知道什么惊喜吗？哎，天玑9400这一代的缓存啊，简直是跟不要钱一样的堆啊！去年的9300上面呢，为了在有限的面积塞下全大核的设计，这缓存就不得不让出空间来，给的非常的紧俏啊。这 X4 内核只有一颗给了1兆的2环，剩下都是512K 的2环。
I guess that could help with the efficiency of the E-cores, the higher amount of cache. Yeah, yeah, like a lot more cache, definitely.
今年的天玑9400
and as they said, 100% more L2 cache, 50% more L3 cache. So this data definitely lines up with what we've heard from them as well on their website.
特别的大方啊！可能是因为3纳米密度提升的关系，不仅超大核 X925 给足了2兆的2级缓存，这一次3颗 X4 也全都看齐了上代最大的那颗 X4， 全部都给了1兆的缓存，等于是这3个 X4 全都是去年的超大核。而 A720 的缓存也翻了1倍，给到了512K。包括整体的3级缓存也从上一代的8兆增大了50%，来到12兆， 再搭配10兆的 SLC 缓存，这个缓存大小
Yeah, the SLC cache, this is the difference. I believe the A18 Pro has 24 megabytes here. So if you ever wonder why can Apple compete despite having like a third slower memory, or why does this not even comprehensively beat the A18 and GPU, the 18 Pro and GPU task despite 40% more memory bandwidth? That will usually come down to this. But to be honest, a lot of people will say like, oh, Apple basically cheats with so much SLC. That is not correct. You still need, like, implementing SLC cache in a way that all components, all CPU cores, all GPU cores can equally leverage it is actually very complicated design. So it's not like just a gift where you can increase the system level cache. And of course, don't forget, more cache results in sometimes in higher latency, because now your task literally has to travel through more silicon. So yeah, I would be interesting to know how big the Dimensity 9400 is. It definitely will be bigger than the 9300. There is no density increase in N3 that would justify doubling cache without increasing it, but it's definitely an impressive chip. And I've always said I'm all for larger chips, as long as, especially now that we do have very dynamic utilization where some parts of the silicon can even be fully turned off or at least be made to run at a very low frequency. It just makes sense to now use wider chips instead of chips that are atrociously high clocked. 3.62 gigahertz being actually 400 megahertz lower clocked than Apple's latest A18 Pro, way like 600 megahertz to maybe 700 megahertz lower clocked than the upcoming Snapdragon 8 Gen 4. So definitely some interesting focus on efficiency here that can be achieved by giving you a lot more cache. Who would have guessed?
真的是给的相当慷慨啊！看起来啊，这9400的 X925 超大核是能够访问全部大核簇的 L2 缓存的啊，再加上 L3 和 SLC 啊，在大约22兆的时候呢，是出现了延迟上升的情况，它的缓存要显著的比9300的 X4 超大核来的更充裕啊。包括这次3颗 X4 大核实际可用的缓存也都比上一代的 X4 超大核要更多了。而 H20 小核簇呢，倒是并不能访问 SLC 缓存，但凭借 L3 的提升，它能访问的缓存总量也从上一代的。
Yeah, so those are the details that matter, like in implementation. And then, of course, you have to design apps and operating systems and APIs that are actually really dynamic and know, like, oh, in this case, it's the most efficient to use the E-cores, but because the E-cores have a very low amount of cache themselves, they would need the help of one P-core or maybe two P-cores very low clocked, or maybe they can do the tasks by utilizing the SLC. But in this case, they don't have access to the SLC. So do we give it one X4 core, or do we maybe give it one X95 core, or maybe like two X4 cores to help with a specific task? Or do we just utilize all cores but just really reduce the frequency on those P cores to keep power consumption in check? That is, of course, where in gaming, especially, like it really depends like how your threads are utilized. Usually there is one world thread that kind of renders the core game logic. Then you would spread yourself out a little bit for other tasks from the game, from the NPCs to some of the core game physics. So some tasks that can then also basically give tasks to the GPU. This is where, of course, on one SoC, system level cache is is a very, very good thing, and it's also a very expensive thing to really double and triple down on.
6兆左右增加到了8兆左右啊，可以说这次每颗 CPU 核心的缓存资源都比前代充裕了很多啊。峰值频率上，这9400的定频也比9300要激进了不少。
I actually wouldn't say that. Like, I would say that 400 megahertz increase, yes, percentage-wise, it's of course a larger increase than from A18 Pro to from A17 Pro to A18 Pro. But I would say those frequency increases make sense to me. For one, the larger cache helps a little bit with efficiency too. And then of course the jump to N3, it probably would sit just a tiny bit outside of the optimal efficiency window, where I would argue that at maximum speed these cores probably would still consume more energy than these 2.85 gigahertz cores, but I would argue that they very easily consume less energy than the previous 3.25 gigahertz X4 core.
3颗X4的大核也都可以跑到3.3G 的频率 ，A720也提到了2.4G。一开始我是有点好奇啊，这么高的一个频率，对吧？功耗能不能控制得住啊？毕竟现在旗舰机已经是能效为王的时代了，对吧？高频的极限性能也是要以能效为前提的嘛，不然用处就不大了。那后面马上要发的零售机上面呢，其实我们测了非常完整的能效曲线。不过这次工程机摸都已经摸到了，就先简单来给大家看一下工程机的能效曲线好了。
Okay, so they achieve over 9,000 on Geekbench. I believe this is the same test where they get like 9,300 from the A18 Pro, because obviously they help out with cooling. But it does really seem like it, wait. Yeah, so it will be more efficient than the 9,300 plus. Again, the 9,300 plus really isn't super efficient by any metric, but yeah, interesting.
确实啊，这个 CPU 能效看着还是挺
That's crazy, chat.
给力的啊。除了 CPU 之外 ，GPU 也是重中之重。这次的天玑9004换用了 ARM 最新推出的 G925 GPU 架构，规模和
high frequency increase from 1300 to 1612. Really nice that they're managing to not go super crazy here with power consumption despite the frequency increase. They do have 12 cores. I do not know how those cores compare in size and in instructions to Apple's cores. Of course, we know that the A18 Pro maxes out at 6 cores. It probably is more than Apple's, just like on a raw silicon perspective. But that's that's of course not an excuse for Apple. Like, I dislike the fact that the A18 is like 90 square millimeters and the A18 Pro is 105. I would have kind of liked to see like a 120 square millimeter die or something like that from Apple. Maybe give us a 7th GPU core. God forbid you give us 8 finally, and then we finally move beyond like the 5-6 cores that we have gotten for such a long time.
上一代一样是12核，得益于3纳米的改进 ，GPU 的频率可以拉得更高了，峰值频率来到了1612兆，创下了手机 GPU 的记录啦。我们待会儿也会来看一下，这么高的频率下，功耗会不会很高
？Seemingly not。
其实光看架构的话 ，ARM 这一颗 G925 的 GPU 并不算大换代，更像是小。
10 cores or more configurability. Well, yeah, but those are the API supports and stuff. Oh, that's multi-sampling anti-aliasing. That's not really different features. Yeah, like the feature, like the G720 was already pretty feature complete, I guess. Like, do you need it to artificially support some kind of extra feature? Like, it does support variable rate shading. It does support ray tracing. FRC, okay, don't even know how much that is utilized, or FRC, FABC, version 1. Okay, so those are just, yeah. That isn't the thing that really shows me how different a core design is.
小修小补，它还是基于 ARM 在去年的 G720 上引入的第5代的 GPU 架构，每个 GPU 核心基本的配置也保持不变。不过这个 G925 是引入了一些新功能来改善它的效率，比如最大的改进是用上了 Fragment Prepass 片段预处理，你可以理解为一种经过 ARM 改进的 HSR 技术。那在图形渲染的过程中啊，这一类技术可以提前筛除那些你视角上看不到，比如说被遮。
That's very smart. I believe NVIDIA has been improving stuff like that for literally years. like the stuff you call to like the actual rendering pipeline, that you're very smart in ignoring stuff that that the user doesn't actually see on screen, of course. That should help out with some like some RAM utilization, stuff like that as well. It's unfortunate, like this feature like sounds like it will be really, really good if it's really taken advantage of by developers. Like, I know it will do some stuff automatically, but it will not like magically turn like all your LOD settings differently and stuff like that. So developers would really have to go back into their apps and maybe create like a Dimensity 9400 optimized settings, similar to what we have like the Steam Deck optimized settings and stuff like that.
档的片段，这样在后面着色的时候呢，就不会去处理这一些不可见的片段了，可以节约 GPU 的计算量，降低功耗。其实所有的现代 GPU 啊都有使用类似这种 HSR 技术，但是 ARM 这一次的 Fragment Prepass 呢，可以剔除更多被遮挡的片段，
That's cool.
包括复杂场景啊，还有传统 HSR 很难顾及到的一些犄角旮旯啊，它都能够去做剔除，并且它对于几何体的绘制顺序是没有要求的 ，GPU 不需要根据深度重新给物体排序来确定哪些地方。
I wonder if that can create any kind of artifacts visually, if they are that aggressive in like sample perfect culling, like that they might actually like start deleting stuff that like once you move like what you view, and it has to now start calling that. Like, I wonder like if that could create any artifacts.
可以把排序的这个开销给省下来。反正总的来讲，这是一个节省计算资源的技术。
Yep, that's true.
还有一个改进是 Tile 单元的吞吐量翻倍了。其实之后我打算给大家科普一下 Tile 的概念，这个其实是手机 GPU 非常非常重要的一个东西。
Double Tile.
简单来说，手机 GPU 的食道太窄了啊！如果像 PC 显卡那样直接把食物吞下去，一次性处理整张画面呢，它就会噎住啊！所以就需要先把它的画面细嚼慢咽成一个个小切片，才能够吞下去。那 G925这一次改进的 Tile 呢，你就可以理解为牙齿啊，对吧？这个 Tile 吞吐量大了，其实就是你的牙齿更有力，嚼画面嚼得更快了嘛。那除此之外 ，G925还有一些前后端的改进。说实话呢，这些改进其实你说大也都不大吧，都没有从根本上改变 GPU 的架构设计。再加上今年发哥的 GPU 还是12核的规模，每个核的规格也没有大的变化。其实我刚看到 PPT 的时候呢
Okay, so this is very interesting. This seems to be an efficiency optimized design, which, like, I mean, they say it's 40% faster, so it has to be more faster than just what the clock speeds suggest, because what were the clock speeds here? 1612 versus 1300. What is that difference? 1612 divided by 1300. That's a 24% increase in clock speeds. So somewhere extra 15% have to be found. That would be interesting.
还是12核的规模，每个核的规格也没有大的变化。其实我刚看到 PPT 的时候呢，是没有抱什么期待的，感觉这个9400的 GPU 可能又是能效稍微提升一点，对吧？全靠超频的小迭代吧。然而啊，当我们测完 GPU 能效之后啊，别说小迭代啊，这次 GPU 提升差点没把我下巴惊掉。这里我先拿这个工程机的能效简单给大家展示一下，看看啊。确实不是一般的强啊。
Do we know what GPU is going to be used in the Snapdragon 8 Elite? Oh my god, my finger. Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 GPU. It's going to use the Adreno 830. Okay, so gonna be interesting what the difference will be for the 8 Gen 4. They did promise some pretty crazy upgrades, like the leaks have promised thus far.
你知道吗？发哥今年这个 GPU 啊，能效进步啊，是比它的 CPU 部分还要大得多的，相当的厉害啊！到底怎么回事呢？待会儿零售机的视频我们就来详细说一说吧。除了传统的光山化性能之外，发哥这一次9400的 GPU 在光追单元上也有升级，给光追单元引入了一个比较重要的特性 OMM。我们在黑神话悟空那期视频里其实已经介绍过 OMM 了。 这是 NVMe 在40系显卡上引入的技术，它是专门用来处理光追场景里面判断半透明材质
So why do they not promise a higher ray tracing uplift?
植被这些半透明材质啊，有些场景里面这个数量是非常多的，但是光线穿过每一片树叶前，都得计算叶子上哪些部分能够透光，只有能透光的部分，光线才会穿过去，这个工作量是巨大的。而 OMM 就可以高效的标记出材质上半透明的部分 ，GPU 啊就不用对整个叶子采样了，可以节约不少资源。目前手机端已经有了一些 OMM 的 demo， 比如说3D Mark 就做了一个 OMM 的特性测试。我们实测天玑9400在这种有大量植被的光追场景里面，开启 OMM 可以带来接近30%的帧率提升，还是挺可观的。当然，手机上讲光追创新的前提呢，可能还是得有足够多的游戏支持光追吧，不然就只是一直在占未来了。AI 部分的改进也是发哥比较在意的地方啊。那这一次的 NPU 升级为了890，性能提升到了上代的1.4倍，进步也是挺大的。发哥也给我们演示了几个好玩的东西啊，像是手机本地的 AI 视频生成，本来是大厂在云端计算的，现在在手机本地也有了轻量化的方案，这效果还挺像那么一回事的啊。NPU 890还带了2倍的 diffuser 的性能，在这个演示里，通过熬骨骼的方式可以控制人的这个动作，从图片生成动图。还有就是本地跑多模泰尔大模型，现在可以达到每秒50 tokens 的处理能力了，支持的文本长度也提升到了32K tokens。多模态的典型应用就是理解图片信息。发哥这里是给我们演示了让 AI 看一个作业里的数学题，然后直接回答出一个答案。我猜发哥的朋友们应该还是挺喜欢看我们的视频的，哈哈。那伴随着端侧 AI 的
Okay, that's enough for the explainer video. Nothing too crazy here. It really depends on also like real world testing for stuff like the ray tracing improvements, the AI stuff, and how many developers actually utilize any of that, and what specific tests they run. Like, I really don't care just about like silly token numbers and stuff like that. So let us actually look what is the Oppo Find X8 Pro delivering.
今年的各种创新，对吧？那这一期视频啊，我们就用手上的这台 Oppo Find X8 Pro 来给大家实测看看啊，这天玑9400的性能能效到底怎么样 ？ARM 的新架构，台积电的3纳米工艺，各自表现又如何？这次发哥的 GPU 又有什么样的惊喜？还有 Find X8 Pro 的游戏性能究竟有多么的恐怖啊！视频的内容很多，我们一个个来聊啊。那由于 Find X8 Pro 目前还没有发布，它的外观和具体的配置其实都是没有解禁的啊。那我也不能给你们看它背面的这个设计。所以这期视频呢，我们的重点也是来关注一下这个天玑9400的性能能效表现。不过这一次呢，真的得感谢 OPPO 的同学啊，各种帮忙，搞定了 root 权限，我们才得以用 Find X8 Pro 画出非常完整的9400的能效实现。
You see, and this is very interesting because they do call out that they have like root level access to these chips from Android manufacturers, but what are they doing with Apple to get like all their power consumption numbers and stuff like that? That has always fascinated me, how they achieve those like the ability to even run those benchmarks.
里的这个 X925啊、X4啊，还有 A720，每种核心都给完整测出来了。那就废话不多说，赶紧来看一下吧。首先上来我就想知道啊，这次 ARM 的 X925超大核是什么水平？所以啊，我们还是端出行业的测试标准 Spec 2017来看一下这天玑9400超大核有多强吧。如果看峰值成绩的话，
they call it the Precision 9400 when it's translated, but it is the Dimensity.
X925真的是相当给力啊！它在3.6G 的频率下，整数是可以跑到8.7。
I still think the A18 chip is quite under like appreciated. Like, this is a 2-year-old chip based on N4, not even N4P. Look how it smokes the Gen 3, like Gen 2, which is even on still basically the same node. And yeah, even here, like the X4 course on the 9400, like, yeah, basically took up until now to actually match and slightly exceeded.
第3分相比8Gen 3的 X4 强了17%，整数赶上了苹果 A16 的性能，但是 X925 最强的是它的浮点。这次的浮点
also makes just more sense for more modern computations in general.
一天的
Of course,
13.6。
gives it also now a higher IPC than the A16 in terms of FP computation because they're like 3.6 gigahertz versus 3.4 and even versus the A17 Pro. But again, like how do they even make the Spec 2017 run like on the like is there even a very like optimized version for the A series chips? This has always confused me. Like is there like Spec 2017. Like I know you can sideload stuff with like a developer account, but how much sense does it make if you don't really have an app that was built for that platform? Spec 2017 iOS. Yeah, there's like GitHub stuff and stuff like that. Like nah. This is only experimental playground to run to Spec 2017 on iOS. Use at your own risk. Yeah, it really like I have no idea how they get these tests and or even like present them with so much confidence. But yeah, I guess like we are watching it, so they cannot be doing that much wrong if they attracted our attention and are keeping it.
7分啊，什么概念？它比8进3的 X4 浮点强出了30%啊！它已经超过了苹果的 A17 Pro 啊，仅次于今年的 A18 系列啊。9400的这一颗 X925 在 3.6G 赫兹下的 Spec 单核性能，甚至还超过了 4.6G 赫兹的英特尔 Ultra 7 258V 和 5G 赫兹的 AMD HX 370。
Yeah, it seems like ARM has really taken a leap. If you feed it with enough cache, the fact that it's like that it's a reduced instruction set really doesn't seem to matter at that point.
PC 级的超大核，这真的是安卓阵营单核性能提升最大的一次啦。不过很多的观众肯定会说啊，这峰值跑分嘛，图一乐，对吧？要看还是得看这个能效啊。所以呢，能效曲线赶快端上来吧。这个就是天玑9
this is where we still have basically over generational difference from Apple here. Not only do you of course get higher performance here, but you also get it at lower speeds. And again, they do have this crazy root level access where they probably like run the test every couple of 100 megahertz or something like that, so they can draw a full-on curve, while with A18, the A17, stuff like that, we only get those numbers for like the regular performance and like the low power mode.
925的 Spec 能效曲线了。它的整数能效相比8进2的 X3 和8进3的 X4可以说是稳步提升，但依旧惜败给了苹果 A16 的大核。考虑到这个里面还包含3纳米的 buff， 整数方面姑且只能算是。
And by the way, anybody who just says, "Oh, you know, Apple wins because they utilize newer nodes," the A16, we saw how performant it was, despite being like 1/4 of a node worse than other N4P chips. Yeah, so yeah. Don't be too like crazy here. Apple still is the CPU king.
迭代吧，然而浮点的能效就完全不一样了。这是 X925的浮点曲线。
Nice around matching here. The basically the efficiency of the A17 Pro and being able to deliver you a little bit more performance at slightly higher power draw. Again, I cannot speak about the actual realistic power consumption here. I've always found that their like peak power consumption levels are a little crazy, which leads me to suspect that they are very much measuring spikes rather than like anything like realistically sustained. But again, I have to use that data because we do have only this chart.
我勒个去啊！这和之前根本不是一个世代的东西啊！这是跨了2。
Man, I feel sorry for Qualcomm if they really have to go up to 4.2 gigahertz, like. And we know that Orion on N4P is already so much less efficient than even M3. Like now that of course Apple has A18 M4 chips, like I just wonder what will happen with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 here now that it of course uses different types of cores.
代的提升幅度啦，它这个浮点能效啊，甚至打赢了 A17 Pro 啊。单核能效部分达到了上一代苹果的水平啊， 考虑到去年安卓的单核还没赶上 A15呢，这确实是相当大的进步了啊。不过和今年外星科技一般的 A18 比起来，依然还是有差距的。那么问题来了，这次的 X925，
This is why I'm telling Apple, be aggressive, delay the Pro models next year if you have to, and give us a 2nm based chip.
这个能效曲线的提升啊，自然也包含了台积电 N3E 的功劳。虽然我们之前在苹果的视频里就讲过，这个
3nm是相对比较水的一次
大节点更新啊，但它也不是完全没有提升的。所以我也想知道，这刚刚看的曲线里面有多少进步是
That's integer, okay.
X925这个架构带来了。为此啊，我们就测了同一颗9400上的 X4 核心。你能看到，对比9400自己的 X4，这个 X925的进步依然还是挺明显的，尤其是在浮点方面，确实强了不是一点点啊。越往高频高性能段，强的就越多。至于3nm工艺的进步呢，我们可以稍微对比一下9400的新 X4和去年8进3和9300上的4nm的 X4。新旧两代同为 X4 核心的情况下，9400的核心能效总体还是有进步的，尤其低频部分啊，这个提升会更明显一些啊。包括2代制程下的这个 A720，你可以看出来，新的 A720也确实是要更强的，总体也能有10%出头的能效提高啦。当然，这里面也不光是3nm的差距吧，可能还包括发歌设计上的优化呀、供电的优化呀，以及内存、缓存上的一些改进啊。
Yeah, it's really hard to measure some stuff like that. We cannot even apply like the basic thought. Oh, look, we have to. Well, I guess you can compare the previous 1MB X4 chip that was running at like 3.2 something gigahertz versus the new 3.3 gigahertz. But then, of course, the other X4 chips in the last gen, they were based like they had less cache. You cannot fully compare the new A720 cores because they now have double the cache. So yeah, this is like we do have a pretty good way to compare like the new X4 with 1MB, well, which is basically like the old one but on a newer node. And it does seem to benefit slightly from N3E, but it's not earth-shatteringly more efficient. So if somebody really wants to come in and say like, oh, Apple was so much better than N4P devices because they had N3B and N3E chips, it's not true. It's simply not true. Those efficiency gains were never that crazy. The 3nm node by TSMC, there's a reason why, for example, Samsung never bothered to make a 3nm FinFET node, and that has simply to do with the fact that it's incredibly difficult to make FinFET transistors that freaking small, and this is why we will only see quote-unquote bigger gains once TSMC switches to GAAFET or gate-all-around transistors. However, at that point, we're hitting other diminishing returns, which is the fact that the transistors get so small that now the crosstalk between transistors, because of basically quantum physics, could become an issue for scaling up performance once you make transistors so freaking small.
基本还是印证了我们之前的看法，就是3nm这个大节点的能效进步确实明显没有当年，比如说升级到7nm来的那么大了。
7nm is so big, yeah. the jump from previous nodes to 7nm really sticks out, and the jump from 7 to 5 was very, very good, I would argue, given the fact that it was just a 2-year wait. Right, so we had N7, N7P, N7P was then rebranded to N6, but still the year after N7P, we got N5. And if you want to know the chips, that's basically the A12 chip, the A13 chip, and the A14 chip. Yeah, so Apple was really, really just on lock with getting the latest nodes. Ideally, we would have kind of been capable of having N3P this year if TSMC's nodes hadn't been delayed. Of course, we got 5 nanometer A14, N5P based A15, and 4 based A16, and then N3B based A17 Pro chips. So not only do we have a longer gap from 5 to 3 nanometer, but the gap itself is smaller than the the performance improvement is actually smaller than from 7 to 5 nanometer. So we are definitely living in an era of diminishing returns here.
就该来看看 CPU 多核了，又到了我们喜闻乐见的赛博斗蛐蛐时间啊。
I have to say, and Sam Hein here, I actually fully agree with some interactions we have on Twitter. Raw multi-core beyond like 5,000 on smartphones really only matters if you can utilize it well with a lot of efficiency. Even on the A18 Pro, like those results where it gives you like 9300, I don't see any real world test ever giving you those kinds of like not of course the exact score, because not every app is Geekbench, but just not getting this full utilization. It just doesn't make sense. You don't want your phone to like work at like peak performance for like 20 seconds and then not at all almost, because it just got so freaking hot. You don't want your hand to get so hot, even if the phone was really good at quickly dissipating all that heat. You don't want that heat to hit your hand. And even if you could do all that, dissipate all the heat, then quickly somehow cool the chassis, you wouldn't want that kind of battery draw. Yeah.
GB6 多核能效曲线，那这一根就是天玑。
Yeah, this is where it gets a little bit crazy. Like, this is where I have already said I still have no idea where exactly the A18 Pro will ever consume 12 watts, but okay. So we do have 9300 here. I believe they get almost like 9400. And after the latest iOS 18.0.1 update, that's actually what we see on some A18 Pro devices. And the reason why I use those high scores, usually I would put the A18 Pro firmly now at 9000, but every chip they test here is giving higher results than actual like usual tests. So I assume that has everything to do with how they subject it to extreme cooling and stuff like that. Now you will see it is still more efficient than the 9300 in the sense that it gives you, of course, higher performance at the same power consumption. But yeah, it's definitely like once you push it far beyond, once you push it like beyond the 8500 range, this is where you can really feel that just increasing the frequency on all those X4 cores, on the A720 cores, really like N3E will not solve that issue.
CPU 多核能效啦，还是老规矩， 曲线
Sorry, I need subtitles again.
位置越偏左上，能效就是越好啊。那天玑9004由于这个 CPU 核心的规模又大，峰值频率还定得高，所以峰值功耗还是蛮吓人的，甚至可以飙到18瓦以上。
Again, and this is the same defense that I gave the A18 Pro. I have no idea if that is actually something that is a sustained peak power consumption or if that's a spike in peak power consumption. But since they apply the same methodology to all the chips kind of equally, again, I still don't know if they have similar root level access to Apple. But yeah, you can see that just the generational improvement on the A18 versus all these other chips is phenomenal.
但它其实只需要1半的功耗就能达到90%的性能了啊，这个就是边际效应嘛。那除开这一段只有跑分才能达到的峰值性能段呢，9400的整体 CPU 多核能效应该说
You can see this is the A18 Pro in its E mode, in its E-core mode, or it's not in its E-core, it's just in its low power mode, roughly matches the efficiency here of the 9400. Again, cannot tell you how absolutely accurate this is, but definitely A18 Pro is more advanced here overall. But you see that this is still an improvement over previous generations.
还行。 它相比9300还是带来了一定提升的，但显然不会像比如说去年的9300至于9200那么的炸裂，对吧？那从 GB6的中高频来看啊，能效上这个8核处理器还是
I know also some people will talk about like A18 utilizes SME more or whatever. Like I don't give a f about that anymore. We saw that it's kept outperforming it in Spec 2017 as well, and I still have no idea how optimized Spec 2017 is even remotely for iOS. So yeah, I'll just look at their graphs. I'll give you some basic analysis from my part on that, and then you can make your analysis based on
苹果的
that.
6核的 A18兄弟啊，不过9400的这个 CPU 啊，有一个很大的亮点，就是它在日常使用最多的这个中低频段，表现得非常不错。相比前代是大幅改善了中低频能效啊，比如跑到3000分啊，在9300的机型上需要耗费接近2.5瓦的功耗，而9400就只需要1.8瓦。这个表现已经赶上苹果的水平了。那对于大多数的用户来说呢，这一部分的提升要比你怼满功耗去冲击
But
这个
also
最
one needs to consider that a lower score it can be achieved through different things. We don't know like what is the percentage of clock speed reduction. Like we know of course with the low power modes roughly where it is, but did they lower like more of the P core clock speeds? Did they lower more aggressively the E cores? So even if they might meet technically on the graph here, the actual real world implication might be very different still. If the P cores on the A18 Pro, one P core might still clock significantly better or just deliver more performance than now the X95 cores at that level, but it just like doesn't want its E cores or something like that, or the other way around. It's really hard to make efficiency statements on chips with multiple core types.
高跑分有意的多啦！除了硬件之外呢，其实 OPPO 和发哥这一次还一起深入开发了新的这个潮汐引擎啊，它带来了安卓的第一个精准算力单元级功耗模型，可以更精确的计算实时子系统的功耗，并且它也带来了第一个 CPU 缓存和 SLC 缓存的动态分配方案。那对于应用
Okay, that's definitely the kind of access they don't have with
CPU 啊，我们
Apple.
再来看看 GPU。我们之前一个视频已经讲了。
Okay, so those numbers then probably are very accurate, those power consumption metrics, because obviously they do not have the same kind of access by Apple. But if Oppo like deliberately like gives them access to even understand just how much cache is being utilized, yeah, that's pretty cool.
规模还是跟上代一样大。这 G925 架构啊，也是在去年架构的基础上做改进的。而3纳米工艺前面的 CPU 对比，你们也看到了对吧？也就那样啊。那看起来这个 GPU 应该还是挤牙膏喽。我们来看一下3D Mark 的 Still Nomad Lite 的能效曲线就知道了。我去，不测不知道，一测吓一跳啊！这一代的 GPU 是大提升啊，直接能效曲线就飞到天上去了。整段 GPU 的曲线从低频到高频提升都特别的大，2瓦的低功耗场景改善是最显著的。同样2瓦功耗下，9400相比9300是高出了超过75%。
That's really crazy. Like, and again, thanks to those tools, I really hope again the A18 comparison here. It's hard for me to tell just how accurate it is, but given that I hope that the data, at least for those chips from the same company, are correct. To see that 75% higher efficiency basically is crazy.
而高性能段9400同样表现不俗，GPU 峰值在跑到1600。
I still, by the way, I have never seen the A18 like given that it uses 6 watts in games, I really struggle to see how it uses almost 12 watts in Still Nomad Lite, but yeah.
高频时功耗其实和1300兆的9300 Plus 差不多但是性能却强出了37%。9400如果是跑到9300 Plus 的峰值性能，只需要不到6瓦的功耗这几乎是腰斩了！我勒个去，这 GPU 真的是太惊艳了！应该说这是天玑历史上 GPU 能效提升最大的一代那么为什么天玑9400的 GPU 可以在规模不增加、架构小改进、工艺小提升的情况下强出这么多呢？其实这更像是许多方面的改进叠加起来之后，这个量变引起了质变。 首先最大的工程、
that was a very interesting like translation. I guess it means that a lot of small improvements led to a final big improvement.
还是这一次 GPU 引入的新特性
Okay, we've talked about that in the
我们前面
architecture
就已经说
video.
到了，它可以改善遮挡剔除的效率，通过少处理不需要的片段，降低 GPU 的计算量。那我们也抓了一下跑 S3L 时的管线数据啊，发哥的这代 GPU 啊，似乎是直接用 Fragment Prepass 替代了原本的 Early ZS 加 Forward Pixel Kill 的一个流程，等于是可以剔除的比以前更狠了。它的 Kill Rate 从43%提升到了75%，意味着每个像素的计算压力啊都降低了56%啊。其实还有很多容易被忽视掉的改进啊，也都影响到了 GPU 的能效，包括驱动层的很多创新。应该说啊，这一次天玑9004改进的重点就是 GPU 驱动的效率，这不光包含软件层面的效率，也包括 CPU 和 GPU 通信链路的效率。因为 GPU 的驱动开销啊，其实很大程度是由 CPU 来消化的。CPU 发指令给 GPU 执行啊，整个过程要经过一连串的链路，包括总线通信啊、缓存一致性管理等等。那9004这一次有一个工程啊，就是它的 CPU 缓存是大幅改进了，这很大程度上还缓和了 CPU 和 GPU 之间
better communication between CPU and GPU.
还有很多驱动工具上的优化，比如 GPU 驱动中的 Shader Compiler 要负责把这个高层的代码转换成 GPU 能够执行的这种底层的机器码，那它的这个性能也会影响整体的 GPU 的效率。所有以上这些
I really have to say, I know I sometimes shit on like their testing where like real world results don't really correspond with some of their artificial benchmarks. I would still argue that will be the case here, but just shout out to the Dimensity 9400 for a very, very efficient GPU.
有了9004惊为天人的 GPU 能效啦。所以说白了，在9004的 GPU 升级中，硬件改进是一部分，但如何最大化的利用硬件，这个也是发哥很花心思、很努力的地方啊。最终的产品也确实是不负众望啊。这天玑9004 CPU 单核大提升，多核是正常提升，而 GPU 嗨翻全场。总的看下来，能效表现是还可以啊。那这对于游戏来说倒是一个很好的消息啊。那么天玑9004能不能再次刷新我们对手机游戏性能的认知呢？我们就拿这一台 Find X8 Pro 来玩几个游戏试试看好了。先上个简单点的小菜，如王者荣耀，你知道 Find X8 Pro？
What is that? 60 FPS and 120 FPS, and that's power consumption.
跑王者这种比较轻松的游戏有多逆天吗？它是我们测过的首台王者60人模式整机跌破2瓦的机器，哇，这算是一个里程碑了。
Wow, 20%
120帧高
more
清也
efficient
只有
than the iPhone.
2.7瓦的整机功耗，双双突破下限了。这个难度太低了，我们换一个传统高难度项啊，原神的30度5G 魔鬼测试，813P 最高画质下。Find X8 Pro 直接一根线顶满60帧跑到底，而且你知道它的机身温度有多低吗？30度5G 测试啊，最高没有超过44.3度啊！这个发热控制真的是只能用
definitely a lot better here than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, and even better than the iPhone.
谱来形容了。我觉得这 Find X8 Pro 是真正第一台轻松。
Should be noted a few things here though, like just that we are absolutely here on the same level. The iPhone does run at a higher resolution, and there is a 60 FPS limit here. So you are not getting the most comprehensive data. In fact, the Find X Pro kind of runs at the lowest resolution here. So it's not a one-to-one test. So iPhone runs at 8733 times 864. That's 1.618 and this runs at 1787 times 813, so that's 1.452. So there is like a 10% difference here in resolution that would probably allow the iPhone to also push beyond. And again, question about same quality settings. I don't need to show you again those lost results. Where were we here? Like there can be differences where even if you put something on the same settings level, it will not perform the same. share updated for 9400 or it doesn't count. It's not per chipset, it's per OS thing. The game has been updated a lot since then. That's what I mean. This literally uploaded 8 days ago. So yeah, there is still a question like if iPhone is just by default way better for gaming because the developers actually bothered to optimize settings. Yeah, and this account is either blocked or muted because they're a notorious fanboy here.
征服原神5G 魔鬼测试的机器啊！毕竟之前那些满帧的游戏手机都是狂堆散热加激进的调度策略死扛的，而这一次的天玑9400，那简直就是不费吹灰之力啊！就靠着自己离谱的能效，轻轻松松就把游戏跑了。你知道还有让我震惊的是什么吗？绝区零的测试啊！ 在9300的机器上，需要跑到6.4瓦以上的功耗，都不见得能跑60帧啊。而换了9400的 Find X8 Pro，
like look at the resolution difference, by the way, guys. Here, like we're looking at 10% more on each axis, so we are looking at like beyond 20% higher resolution on the iPhone. Let me be correct here. 1728 times 797, that's 1.377, and divided that by 1568, and what? No. Yeah. And divided that by 712. We have the iPhone running at 23% higher resolutions. So again, not to make an excuse, but when we are making those efficiency claims, and by the way, I do believe that the GPU here is more efficient because part of Apple's efficiency can absolutely come here from the more efficient CPU. But this is also why I really don't care about their artificial benchmarks giving us 12 and 18 watt numbers for the GPU when the entire SoC, even on gaming devices, doesn't go beyond 7 watts. So yeah.
可以全程顶满60帧跑，功耗只有4.9瓦，这甚至要比 iPhone 16 Pro Max 还要低啊！
I mean, it's literally not once you consider like this is a 12% difference in power consumption with it versus a 23 plus 1 FPS more versus the iPhone giving you like a 23% higher resolution that technically still makes the iPhone between 8 and 10% more energy efficient.
当然了 ，iPhone 在这里的分辨率是要来得更高一点
It's
的，
a bit
很
higher.
难直接比较。
23% is not a small difference.
这个已经是安卓机在游戏能效上最接近 iPhone 的一次了。再来看一下压力更大的丰田匹诺康尼场景啊，这个就更离谱了。Find X8 Pro 是我们至今测过的手机里唯一一台匹诺康尼都能满帧的手机。
That's very impressive. Here, and again, this is the kind of test where the iPhone probably could just push wattage higher and higher, but again, like that resolution difference is not too big here, but it does still run at higher resolution. So again, getting out the calculator here. How do I clean? That's why. 1728 times 797. Nope. That's 1 point. Okay, so it's the same resolution as before. But this looks higher. Then divided by 1680. And then divided by 763. So here the iPhone runs at about 7% higher resolution, which actually would here suggest, of course, that not only are we higher performance in general, but also like the stability looks a lot better than on the iPhone. So I would argue this definitely does dethrone the iPhone when it comes to the GPU.
手机啊，它甚至比红魔的觉醒模式还要强啊！
Yeah,
而且
I
你知道
don't care about that. What's the power consumption
功耗
here?
才多少吗？6瓦。
Okay, so the efficiency is roughly the same actually as on the iPhone. So it gives you 20% higher performance. Again, FPS like limit, that's unfortunate for testing. For like 18% higher wattage and stuff like that. but the iPhone does run at 7% higher resolution, technically still giving it like higher efficiency. I don't care about that kind of efficiency gain, especially given that the X8 Pro will also have like a pretty large battery inside. I would argue this is very impressive. I would argue this is completely worthless. Like 8 watts. Who wants that in a
6
phone?
瓦就能跑满帧啊！
Oh, it can run full
8.3和
frames.
9300
That's
的机
cool.
其实跑到9瓦以上都不见得能满帧。
I think he means maxes out the frame rate.
嘘嘘，他轻轻松松啊。那最后我们也测了一下明朝的性能，Find X8 Pro
Is that
依然是做
wuthering
到了
waves?
全程满
But like this resolution difference though is a little ridiculous. I think we're looking once again at now 20% higher resolution. So technically in this test, the iPhone is actually a lot more efficient because this does consume like what 17% more power for like 8% more performance. Again, this is all very off the head math. Some stuff can be really wrong, but so that's already not more efficient here. But then the iPhone simultaneously runs at the higher resolution here. And I wish we could just get it. Plus, again, we have seen those settings differences. And those settings differences really are a effort if they like make like the game sometimes look like a generationally different product. This is why I really like, I appreciate Geekerwan, but my king in that regard is still Mr. Mac Wright doing that kind of testing where he will actually like play the game and notice whether it stutters or noticeable settings differences that you might not account for. Like I've seen people when like that PC emulator came out for Android and they were running like Resident Evil, like the game that's now on the iPhone natively. They were like, look, it performs better, and look, it has higher settings, because in one photo it had like higher quality texture, but for one, that one photo never said at which frame rate it ran. And then when you actually saw how the game runs consistently with stutters, with I believe shader compilation issues, it's just so completely uncomparable. And then of course the FPS meter in that emulator was trash too. So yeah, so 1705 times 786, it runs at 1.34 megapixels divided by 1584 divided by 720. The iPhone here runs at 17.5% higher resolution, consumes less power, but runs at slightly lower frame rates. In this test, the iPhone is still the efficiency king, but the stability of the Dimensity 9400 is very impressive here nonetheless.
功耗稍微高一点，6.4瓦，它的能效比起各路的8进3和9300机型来说，也是进步非常大。那从调度来看哪怕是像明朝这种压力很大的游戏，对于天玑9400来说，也只有超大核需要跑在3GHz 赫兹的高频上，其他所有的大核都只是跑在中等频率上，还有很多的余量。
Oh wow, they have now access to like individual cores and how they're utilized during that. That's crazy.
那X8 Pro 也是控制在了
45.7 degrees, the iPhone going up to 47. Again, Apple still needs to improve the cooling performance. And I'm just like, I hate the fact that like a mainstream device like this, the Galaxy S24 Ultra isn't included. Like those gaming phones and like they're not hyper representative of most devices running those chips.
还是非常体面的。哎呀，感觉现在这几个二游跑60帧，对于天玑9400来说已经是随随便便的了哈。这Find X8 Pro 甚至它都不是一台游戏手机，结果这一次评测里没有任何一款游戏是它跑不到60帧的。
That cannot not run
我看这几个二游干脆都开放120帧模式。
No, don't use the higher efficiency. Get yourself super stable 60 FPS and be happy.
要不然得给这天玑9400给闲坏了。
That's not what I
之所以天玑
mean.
9400的游戏性能这么强啊，其实和这一次的超大核升级啊，以及疯狂堆缓存都有关系。单核性能跟缓存啊，恰恰都是
Okay, so the CPU seems to help with overall SoC efficiency here as well. But yeah, it's definitely the GPU that really stands out.
对于玩家来说啊，这次的9400算是正好升级到点子上了。不 不过啊，这么强的能效，我其实也很关心啊，就是 Find X8 Pro 续航会不会非常逆天呢？可惜电池容量啊，包括续航时长这些，现在还没解禁啊。咱们就等以后再来测试看看。
Okay, yeah, but they're like that's because the Oppo Find X8 Pro hasn't even been officially unveiled. It's almost like working right now as a reference device for the Dimensity 9400 and not like its own device.
总的来说 ，Find X8 Pro 上的这颗天玑9400，它的能效表现还是非常给力的。哪怕在9300已经大幅进化过的如今啊，这9400也能算是很优秀的一代升级了。即便光从 CPU 的多核能效曲线去看呢，这9400好像只是一个正常迭代而已，并没有强那么多。但超给力的单核、超大的缓存、优秀的低频能效和逆天级的 GPU 能效，都注定了它的实际体验会很值得一看啊！今年换手机的同学，你们又有福啦！那我现在就想
You students, okay. That's an interesting pitch because nobody but students apparently uses it, but I guess that's their appeal to or maybe it's just a mistranslation. Yeah, that was a very interesting video. So CPU king still the A18 Pro, GPU king I would probably give it now to the Dimensity 9400. I wouldn't actually say it's a more efficient GPU. I would probably say it's about the same, but it's super high memory bandwidth, and definitely the fact that it is willing to use a little bit more power can push it in some scenarios even far beyond. But in real world gaming, still a big difference here, where the iPhone, again, we still need to see those fixes, because to me, and I'm not trying to harp on this too hard, but if those are the differences with high settings, like again, equal settings, then the issue is then those games become completely incomparable, right? If you have such different LOD settings, such different shadow settings. And again, I'm still missing MetalFX upscaling tests, but that is probably similar to ray tracing implementation. That's more an issue on developers who have not utilized it comprehensively on iOS. I hope that when Apple speaks at the end of the month about the M4, they finally mention AI-based MetalFX upscaling on Mac, because for some reason they didn't do so on the M3. Maybe given the fact that the Mac targets higher resolutions and stuff like that, the same neural engine as on the A series chips just wouldn't be fast enough. Yeah, so it's difficult to say. I'm very impressed by some of the result of the Dimensity 9400. My problem with tests like theirs is that, of course, we never see the game, so I cannot tell you if issues like that are actually overcome in some ways by what they're testing. But overall, it's still very interesting to see. I still have to say, if you can actually like more aggressively turn down settings on iOS, you will probably be better off gaming on iOS, especially if you buy yourself like a cooler for the back of the device, now with the A18 series. But if you of course want a fully integrated device, then wait for like a gaming phone based on the Dimensity 9400. Of course, you will have more freedom with more emulators on Android. Apple restricts what kind of emulators can come to iOS, even though of course they are now much more open these days than they were in the past. So CPU king, if you ignore that this says 9300, then GPU king, but it depends a little bit on real world tests. I like with all those benchmarks, I still am apprehensive to like when they run at 12 watts for just the GPU, but real world games run you at 5 watts. I really have a hard time reconciling those differences. My theory is still that it's basically measuring spikes, but again, and I actually cannot say, oh, they will make the same mistake for the Dimensity as they do for the A series chip, because they were given this crazy root level access with even like cache level utilization statistics for the Dimensity 9400, obviously stuff that they have not been given by Apple for any chip, whether it's A17 or yeah. So let's see what Raphael has to say. So first Geekbench AI score for the M4 MacBook Pro. So thank you for that. So those are very, very interesting numbers. He does retweet MaxTech here. he does repost here the IPC comparison chart. So the Orion here definitely right now is last. A18 Pro is first. For integer, it just scales basically with Apple and London Dimensity 9400, even like below the A16. So I guess these are the numbers he took from the Geekerwan test, because they do of course line up with that. That's very, very nice. Yeah, Orion obviously also more optimized here for floating point and integer with this specific architecture. Will be very interesting to see how much they change the Orion cores for the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4. I will of course be looking forward to Geekerwan's videos and other tests. I think this is a Geekerwan video that I liked more than their Apple tests, like where the focus is primarily on Apple. But yeah, a lot of praise here from people I respect on the GPU side. I think that's absolutely fair. And of course, beyond all our expectations for the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, comprehensive like real world testing for Dimensity and 8 Gen 4, not just reference devices or early access devices. It will be also interesting, of course, what does Apple release, because Apple, of course, isn't just releasing us the M4 Pro, but the M4, but also the M4 Pro, M4 Max. Let's see what kind of difference that makes. These results are higher than on the, I believe, than on the M4 iPad Pro. Let me look into that. M4 iPad Pro, Geekbench AI. Those are compute scores, obviously still monumental single core results here. Interesting. But I believe they are a little lower. I believe it goes up to 4500 there on the M4 iPad Pro. So maybe it's like 10% higher clocked or something like that, or just benefits from more stable performance. And it's difficult to tell. And of course, don't forget the M4 MacBooks are not yet out officially, even though it kind of feels like that. Now that we've had unboxing and all those benchmarks, I will keep looking into what comes out. Now the GPU question really arises for the 8 Gen 4. Like with those like rumored improvements, how much more power does it draw or not? Is it as crazy efficient by Android standards as the 9400 is? So a lot of very interesting stuff. Having 3 chips, of course, between the Dimensity 9400, the 8 Gen 4, and the A18 Pro, all being built on the same node is very, very interesting. Gives us a lot more wiggle room to fully analyze those chips. But also have to consider that the N3 node is not as monumental of an upgrade as N4P as maybe the naming might suggest. So let's see if maybe next year we'll finally get a huge node increase. Of course, if we get N3P, that will not be the case. If we get N2, it might be the case. So a lot to look forward to. Yeah, so thank you, of course, to Geekerwan. Thank you to people like Raphael on Twitter. So I had a lot of data to talk about. We've been streaming for almost 2 hours. I know most of you cannot really watch at this time of day, because I believe since a lot of my viewership comes from like India and stuff like that, for you it's like, what, 4 o'clock in the night? But feel free, of course, to check out the video once it's been uploaded. Comment, please, on it. Like it. Subscribe to the channel. Share the video out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Whenever you catch me live, consider sending a small super chat or super sticker. Any small donation helps to keep the channel running. Of course, you can become a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out to Angelica and Max Maximus, who are MarkCheck Pro Max tier supporters right here on YouTube, or you can become a supporter over on Patreon. That's about it for today. Definitely some very interesting data. Again, I would love a company like, or yeah, it's basically is a company like Gamers Nexus to test smartphones in a way, because they are actually testing stuff like different settings. For example, at the time when AAA games started struggling with 6 gigabytes of memory on dedicated GPUs, you could see that even though the settings were the same, and I believe those were also good tests done by Hardware Unboxed, you could see that the thing you actually see on screen looked inferior. Like you didn't have the entire texture loaded and stuff like that. The LOD might be differently managed, even though you technically were clicking on the same setting. So I would be interested to see like all these games. Of course, we cannot fully equalize like resolution apparently. Are the settings actually fully equalized? That is where my main interest comes from. Right now, I'm happy to give Apple the A18 Pro still the undisputed CPU king crown, and I would am happily crowning the Dimensity 9400 the raw GPU king crown. And when it comes to GPU efficiency, I'll have to look into that with real games later on. And if any company watches that plans to make a Dimensity 9400 device, feel free to send me that device. I might compare it with my A17 Pro based iPhone, see if the settings are the same and stuff like that. I would love to see some responses from companies like MiHoYo actually telling us what the settings differences are. And of course, there is the difference that some of these games that now, like Assassin's Creed Mirage and the Resident Evil titles and things like that, they are now getting like dedicated native ports on Apple Silicon, which 8 series chips are Apple Silicon too, and they're not getting that on Android, unfortunately. Hopefully that changes. Maybe the exclusivity window runs out, but then that depends. Do those companies even believe that Android users will buy those games? Those games certainly didn't seem like a huge success on iOS, and I don't know, with Android, like a lot of the Chinese market just being hooked on all these like gacha games, not sure if people would want to spend 20, 30, 40, $50 on like real AAA ports. But yeah, so a lot of interesting stuff to see across the next year and 2 or 3 and 4 and 5. I'll keep you updated. Hopefully I can stay with you for that long, see how it all develops. But yeah, very interesting data, in my opinion, more interesting than last year's stuff, where it was very much like, oh, you can get higher performance, but at a lot higher power draw with like the Dimensity 9300, and the A17 Pro was like definitely the way more efficient chip, but then the iPhone also had way worse cooling. Now the iPhone has better cooling than before, but now this chip is way more efficient than the Dimensity 9300. So in some ways it pulls like 2 steps ahead, but Apple closes at least 1 step there. So it's really interesting, and this is the kind of competition that I really love to see. And whatever they showed at the end, where they showed also like this cache utilization definitely helping with efficiency, that's what I've been asking for all these years. And I give praise here to Mediatek for making a chip that, in my opinion, actually does properly like leverage a smartphone, because chips that are designed to like peak at 8 watts, that to me is like like if you really cannot get great performance below that, or even below 7 watts, then I'm like, yeah, you know what, that is more of a tablet chip at that point. So kudos here, great data, interesting data. Again, some questions on how exactly they measure the 18, but definitely knowing that they have this crazy root level access to the Dimensity 9400. These results are actually questioned the very least out of all the Geekerwan videos I have ever seen. Like maybe I should also now look into like their Lunar Lake stuff, because obviously it's easier to get deep level access on Windows than on iOS still. So maybe their data is similarly correct to how like their how this data looks. But I'll keep you posted. Keep me posted. You guys see when you share stuff on Twitter, feel free to tag me. I love integrating that data. Again, thank you to anyone whose data I used, from Vadim to Raphael. So and I guess I'll keep you just posted because right now we are almost 2 hours in. I've already given you the shout out to do the YouTube jazz, so I will not bother you again. I'll see you guys next time. As always, let me know what you would like to see me cover next time. And this is MarkTech, or this was MarkTech, and this is now MarkTech tuning out. Thank you so much.